On the morning of November 21, 1943, a young Marine named Marcus Holland crouched in a foxhole on Tarawa Atoll, watching another of his brothers in arms crawl forward into the killing zone. He was just 22 years old, for days into his first real combat, and he'd already watched too many good men die from bullets they never saw coming. The Japanese had positioned 800 trained snipers across Betio Island, expert marksmen who'd spent 2 full years perfecting their deadly craft. And they'd been waiting in palm trees and concrete bunkers for 3 days while American forces struggled to establish their beachhead. Now they were systematically picking off Marines one at a time with terrifying precision, and nobody could figure out how to stop them. The morning casualty count told a brutal story that made Holland's stomach turn. 47 Marines had been killed by sniper fire in just the first 72 hours, not from artillery barrages or desperate bonsai charges, but from single, calculated rifle shots fired from positions that seemed impossible to locate. These Japanese snipers would fire once, maybe twice if they were confident, then disappear into silence before anyone could return fire, and by the time Marines figured out where the shot had come from, the sniper had already relocated to his next killing position. American officers had thrown everything they had at the problem, ordering artillery barges to hammer suspected sniper positions until the palm trees were nothing but splinters, sending flamethrower teams to burn entire groves to the ground, concentrating devastating machine gun fire into every tree line they could identify, but nothing worked because these weren't ordinary soldiers taking opportunistic shots. The snipers adapted to every American tactic, firing from a different carefully prepared position each time, killing a Marine, vanishing like ghosts, waiting with inhuman patience, then killing another. The mathematics were simple and absolutely brutal, the kind of numbers that kept commanders awake at night. Each Japanese sniper was averaging 6 American casualties before being eliminated, which meant 6 Marines dead for every single sniper killed. And the 2nd Marine Division was hemorrhaging experienced riflemen faster than replacements could land on the blood-soaked beaches. Holland had grown up on a wheat farm outside Liberal, Kansas, where his family worked 640 acres of land that barely gave them enough to survive in good years. The farm's survival had always depended on one critical thing during harvest season: protecting their crops from the massive flocks of crows that would descend like a black cloud every August. These birds would strip entire rows of wheat before anyone could react, destroying months of backbreaking work in a matter of hours. Holland's father had lost 38% of his entire crop to crows in 1937, which translated to $340 in lost revenue, basically 3 full months of the family's income just gone, eaten by birds. When Holland turned 13 that next spring, his father handed him a Winchester .22 rifle and 12 boxes of ammunition, looked him dead in the eye, and told him the wheat harvest was his responsibility now, that if he lost the crop to crows, the family wouldn't have enough money to plant seed next year. Holland's father taught him something during those long Kansas summers that the Marine Corps Scout Sniper Manual had never mentioned, something that seemed counterintuitive at first but made perfect sense once you understood the psychology. He said, "Don't waste your time shooting at crows while they're in the air or sitting in distant trees, because you'll miss more than you hit and they'll just scatter and come back later. Instead, make the crows waste their energy attacking targets that aren't real, create false movement in the fields that looks exactly like what they're hunting for, and once they commit to attacking those fake targets, they'll land in the same predictable locations every single time to regroup and figure out what went wrong." That's when you shoot them, when they're confused and stationary and completely exposed. Holland's first decoy was beautifully simple, just an old work shirt stuffed with dry hay and mounted on a wooden cross that he'd set up in the field at. Don, with a long piece of twine running back to his hiding spot 50 yards away where he could pull it to make the shirt move and flutter in the breeze. The crows would see that movement from half a mile away and dive at it with absolute confidence, expecting easy pickings, but when they missed and circled around confused, trying to figure out what had just happened, they'd land in the same three trees every single time to regroup with the rest of the flock. Holland would already be waiting in those exact trees with his .22 rifle, and he killed 47 crows in just the first week using that simple method. By the end of that August harvest season, he'd eliminated 180 birds, and the wheat harvest came in at 94% successful, which his father said was the best yield they'd ever had in the history of their farm. Holland never explained the full decoy system to his father in detail, just said it worked and left it at that, but Holland understood the deeper psychology of what he was doing. Crows committed to targets based on movement patterns and the general shape of things, and once they committed to what they thought was food, they followed absolutely predictable patterns of behavior that you could exploit if you were patient and observant. Create exactly the right false target, and you could control precisely where they went next, forcing them to expose themselves in ways they never would have otherwise, and it was simple, effective, and required no complicated tactics or expensive equipment. Now, for years later and 6,000 miles away from that Kansas wheat farm, Holland was crouched in a foxhole watching Marines get shot by Japanese snipers who were doing exactly what those crows had done, waiting patiently for movement, committing. 2 targets based on what they saw, killing with brutal efficiency, and nobody was making these snipers waste their shots on nothing. Holland had been thinking about this problem for 3 solid days, turning it over in his mind during every quiet moment, and he kept coming back to the same simple question. What if Marines stopped being the targets that snipers shot at? What if they created false targets instead, made the snipers fire at carefully constructed decoys while Marines stayed safe and located the muzzle flashes? Forced the Japanese to burn through their limited ammunition shooting at empty helmets while American forces triangulated their positions and eliminated them one by one. He'd mentioned the idea to his squad leader that morning, a tough Marine corporal named Vincent Russo, who was originally from Brooklyn and had been in combat since the nightmare of Guadalcanal. Russo had already lost 8 men to snipers here at Tarawa, and when Holland explained his decoy idea comparing Japanese snipers to Kansas crows, Russo just stared at him for about 10 seconds with an expression Holland couldn't quite read. Then Russo said in that flat Brooklyn accent, "Show me how it works." The Japanese sniper problem at Tarawa was fundamentally different from anything American forces had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns because these weren't just regular infantry soldiers taking opportunistic shots when they saw exposed targets. These were trained specialists, elite marksmen who'd spent years perfecting their craft at dedicated schools that the Imperial Japanese Army had established back in 1937, sniper candidates trained for 18 solid months before being deployed to combat zones, learning advanced camouflage techniques, sophisticated field craft, precise range estimation under varying conditions, and marksmanship skills that would put most American hunters to shame. The best graduates could reliably hit man-sized targets at 600 yards using nothing but iron sights, no fancy scopes, just skill and practice and an almost supernatural understanding of ballistics. By 1943, Japan had deployed approximately 1,200 of these trained snipers across the entire Pacific theater, and 800 of them, two-thirds of their total elite force, were concentrated right here on this tiny coral island at Tarawa. These men had been preparing their defensive positions since August, which gave them 3 full months to dig in properly, 3 months to select and improve their firing positions, 3 months to calculate exact ranges to every likely avenue of American advance and plan multiple escape routes from every location. When the 2nd Marine Division landed on November 20th, they walked straight into a killing field that had been designed by experts who understood exactly what they were doing. The snipers employed a tactic called one-shot, relocate, that was devastatingly effective against conventional counter-sniper doctrine. They'd fire once from a carefully prepared primary position, immediately move to a pre-selected secondary position 30 to 50 yards away, then wait with perfect patience. If Marines came looking for the original firing position, the sniper would shoot them from his new location, and if they didn't come looking, he'd simply wait for another target of opportunity and repeat the entire process. American counter-sniper doctrine, everything the Marine Corps had taught and everything that had worked in training, said you should locate the shooter's position, suppress it with overwhelming firepower, then advance and clear the area. But that entire doctrine required one critical thing: actually being able to locate where the shooter was hiding. Japanese snipers had become absolute masters at remaining invisible, firing from positions that seemed impossible. They'd shoot from inside dense palm fronds 40 feet up where the shadows were deepest, through tiny firing ports and reinforced concrete bunkers that were invisible until you were standing right in front of them, from spider holes that were covered with sand and vegetation so perfectly camouflaged you could step on one without knowing it was there. Some particularly clever snipers had constructed bamboo platforms inside the island's limited fresh water cistern systems, where they could fire through a small opening, then pull a woven cover over themselves and become completely hidden in plain sight. Marine Scout snipers tried desperately to counter them, and the 2nd Division had 12 trained counter-snipers who were good men and expert riflemen. But 12 Marines couldn't possibly cover an entire island when the Japanese had 800 snipers. The mathematics simply didn't work, and everyone knew it. By November 21st, which was the 3rd day of sustained combat, Marine casualties from sniper fire alone had reached 91 men killed or wounded, and most of them were killed outright because Japanese snipers didn't aim for arms or legs hoping to wound. They aimed for the head or center mass of the chest, taking shots that eliminated targets permanently. Holland watched this horror unfold in real time. Watched Marines expose themselves for just a fraction of a second to move between positions. Watched muzzle flashes erupt from locations that seemed empty moments before. Watched good men die from single rifle shots they never saw coming and could never have avoided. The squad Holland belonged to had lost 3 men to snipers in just the first 3 days, and all 3 of them were experienced riflemen who knew what they were doing. All 3 had been careful and followed their training, and all 3 were dead anyway. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco was the first to die. Shot during the chaotic initial landing on November 19th, DeMarco had been a mechanic from San Francisco before the war. A smart kid who was always careful and methodical about everything he did. And he'd successfully advanced from the beach to a shell crater, then made the fatal mistake of looking over the rim to scout his next position. A single rifle shot came from nowhere and went straight through his helmet, and DeMarco was dead before his body hit the ground. Lance Corporal Thomas Barkley was the second man they lost, and Barkley had survived the absolute hell of Guadalcanal, so he knew better than most how to move in combat and how to keep his head down when it mattered. On November 20th, he'd been crossing between two foxholes, moving fast and staying as low as physically possible, but a sniper got him anyway with one round through the upper chest, and Barkley died 30 seconds later while his friends desperately tried to stop the bleeding. Corporal David Torres was the third casualty, and Torres had been a squad leader with 10 years in the Corps, a man who'd seen everything and survived everything. Until he hadn't, he'd been directing fire from behind a disabled Amtrak when a sniper shot him through the neck from a palm tree 100 yards away. And nobody saw the muzzle flash, nobody had any idea where the shot came from, and they never found that particular sniper. Holland had known all three men personally, had trained with DeMarco at Camp Pendleton and shared countless boring conversations, had shared a cramped transport ship with Barkley during the long crossing of the Pacific, had taken orders from Torres for 4 months and respected him enormously, and now all three were dead, shot by enemies they never saw and never had a chance to fight back against. The morning of November 21st, Holland found himself in a foxhole with Corporal Russo and other Marines who'd survived so far. Private Lawrence Bennett from Oklahoma and Private First Class Daniel Carpenter from Georgia. And all 4 men had the same haunted look in their eyes because they'd all seen too many friends die in too many horrible ways. Holland told them about the crows back home, about the decoy system his father had taught him, about creating targets that looked real but weren't. And Russo asked the obvious question about how that would possibly work against trained military snipers. Holland explained as clearly as he could. You take a helmet mounted on a stick or a bayonet or anything that would hold it, then slowly raise it above cover like a Marine carefully looking over a berm to scout the area ahead. From 100 yards away, the sniper sees movement and a helmet-shaped silhouette that looks exactly like a target, and his training and instinct tell him to shoot. He takes the shot, misses because there's no head inside the helmet, and realizes he just wasted a round. But more importantly, when he fires his rifle, there's a muzzle flash, and that flash reveals his position for just a fraction of a second, which is all the time you need if someone's watching for it. Bennett asked the practical question that was probably on everyone's mind. What good does seeing a muzzle flash do if the sniper just relocates immediately after shooting like they'd all been doing? Holland explained that the sniper would definitely move, but he couldn't move far because these weren't random shooters taking wild shots from wherever they happened to be. These were specialists who'd spent months preparing specific positions. Primary positions and secondary positions and maybe tertiary fallback positions. But all of those positions would be within a relatively limited area because that's how you had to operate as a sniper if you wanted to stay effective. Make a sniper fire 3 or 4 times at decoys from his different positions and you'd start to triangulate his overall operating zone. And once you knew that zone, you could saturate it with suppressive fire or call in artillery to eliminate him. Carpenter asked if Holland had any actual proof this would work in combat, and Holland said the only proof he had was killing 280 crows with the exact same method. And as far as he was concerned, snipers were just crows with rifles and the same predictable behavior patterns. Russo looked at Holland for a long moment, and you could practically see him turning the idea over in his mind, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Then he grabbed his helmet and his bayonet and told Holland to show everyone exactly how it worked. Holland took the helmet and jammed the bayonet straight through the helmet's crown, and now he had a helmet mounted on a 14-inch steel rod, a crude puppet that would have to do. He crouched below the foxhole rim and slowly raised the helmet above the edge, moving it the way a real Marine might carefully expose himself to look around. From 50 yards away, it looked exactly like a Marine's head appearing over cover. Russo watched intently, Bennett watched, Carpenter watched, and nothing happened for about 15 seconds, which felt like an eternity, and then a rifle shot cracked across the battlefield like a whip. The bullet hit the helmet with a sharp metallic ping that made everyone's heart jump, knocked it sideways, and bent the bayonet but didn't break it completely. All four Marines hit the dirt immediately, hearts pounding so hard they could hear their own pulses, but Holland was grinning like a crazy person. He asked if anyone had seen the muzzle flash, and Bennett said yes, absolutely. Palm tree about 80 yards to the northwest, maybe 30 feet up in the dense fronds. Holland pulled the helmet back down and examined it, and there was a clean bullet hole punched straight through the front, right where a Marine's forehead would have been if this had been a real head. If that had been an actual Marine looking over that foxhole rim, someone would be dead right now, another name added to the casualty list, another family back home receiving a telegram they dreaded. But it wasn't a real head, it was just a decoy, a helmet on a stick, and now they knew exactly where one of these invisible killers was hiding. Russo grabbed a bar from the foxhole, a Browning automatic rifle loaded with 20 rounds of 30-06 ammunition that could punch through just about anything. And he aimed carefully at the palm tree Bennett had indicated and fired a full magazine into those fronds. The sustained burst sounding like thunder in the confined space. They heard something heavy fall from the tree, hitting branches on the way down, and finally thudding into the ground with a sound that meant someone wasn't getting up. Bennett and Carpenter advanced carefully with their rifles ready, and they found a Japanese sniper at the base of the tree, dead with a single bar round through his chest that had probably killed him instantly. His Arisaka rifle lay next to him, and when they checked, it still had 7 rounds left in the magazine, 7 more Marines he could have killed if Holland hadn't figured out how to make him waste a shot. Russo came back to the foxhole and looked at Holland with a new expression, something like respect mixed with grim determination, and he asked how many more helmets they could rig up like that. Holland said as many as they had bayonets and spare helmets for, and Russo said simply, "Start making them. We're going to kill every sniper on this island using farm tricks from Kansas by noon on November 21st. Holland had rigged 8 helmet decoys, and each one was slightly different. A helmet mounted on a bayonet or a wooden stick or an entrenching tool handle. Simple and crude, but undeniably effective. Russo organized a systematic approach because that's what good squad leaders do. They take chaos and turn it into something that works. His squad would work in pairs, with one Marine operating the decoy and moving it in realistic ways, while another Marine watched for muzzle flashes with binoculars or just sharp eyes. When a sniper fired and revealed his position, they'd mark it precisely, then either engage directly with rifles if the range was right or call in support from a bar gunner or mortar team to eliminate the threat. The first sniper they eliminated after the initial palm tree kill happened at 13:27 hours, and Holland raised a helmet decoy near a destroyed bunker, moving it slowly like someone being very careful. A sniper fired from about 120 yards away and missed the helmet by maybe 6 inches, close enough that they could hear the bullet crack past. And Bennett spotted the muzzle flash coming from a spider hole near a disabled Japanese tank that nobody had checked yet. Carpenter put 3 quick rounds from his M1 Garand into that spider hole, firing on instinct and training, and the sniper didn't fire again. When they checked the position later during a safer moment, they found the sniper dead inside the hole with 2 hits, one through the shoulder and one through the head that ended it. The second sniper they encountered was trickier and tested Holland's theory about patience. Holland raised the decoy 3 separate times, waiting and moving it naturally. But there was no response at all because this particular sniper was being patient, waiting for what looked like a real target worth revealing his position for. So Holland tried something different, something he hadn't even told Russo about because it was just an instinct. He attached a piece of torn uniform to the helmet to create the visual illusion of a body below the helmet, making it look significantly more realistic, and then he raised it much slower, like a Marine very carefully exposing himself inch by inch. The sniper took the bait and fired, hitting the helmet dead center where the bridge of a nose would be, and Carpenter saw the muzzle flash coming from a concrete pillbox about 90 yards to the east. Russo immediately called for a flamethrower team over the radio, and they advanced under covering fire and burned out that pillbox completely, and the sniper died inside without ever getting another shot off. By 1600 hours, which is 4 in the afternoon, Holland's squad had eliminated 7 Japanese snipers using nothing but helmet decoys and basic tactics. 7 confirmed kills, and the most important number was 0. 0 American casualties in Holland's squad during those same hours. Word spread through the 2nd Battalion faster than official radio traffic ever could because Marines talk to other Marines, especially when someone figures out how to stop dying. Other squads heard about the helmet trick, about farm boys from Kansas who knew how to hunt crows, and Marines started improvising their own versions of DKs using whatever materials they had available. Some used helmets on sticks like Holland had shown them, while others made crude mannequins from sandbags and spare uniforms. And one particularly resourceful corporal created a dummy head from mud and rags that he positioned to look like a Marine sleeping in a foxhole, just waiting for a sniper to think he had an easy target. The Japanese snipers couldn't tell the difference, because from 100 yards away through jungle vegetation and heat shimmer, a helmet on a stick looked exactly like a Marine's head, especially if you moved it the right way. They fired at what their training told them were legitimate targets. They missed because there was nothing to hit. They revealed their positions with muzzle flashes, and they died when Americans returned fire. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating for the Japanese. Their snipers were trained to be patient, to wait for absolutely perfect shots, to never waste ammunition on uncertain targets. But when they saw what looked like easy opportunities, their training and their combat instincts told them to take those shots. And once they fired, American Marines knew exactly where they were hiding, and being known was a death sentence. Some of the smarter snipers learned and adapted. They held their fire when they saw helmets appearing over berms or moving in suspicious ways. But that adaptation created an entirely new problem for them, because now they couldn't distinguish between actual decoys and real Marines being cautious. So they hesitated, and hesitation meant losing opportunities to engage actual targets when they appeared. Either way you looked at it, the Americans had gained a crucial advantage that was saving lives with every passing hour. By November 22nd, the 4th day of sustained combat, Marine casualties from sniper fire dropped dramatically to just 19 men, down from 47 on the previous day, which represented a casualty reduction of nearly 60%. The helmet decoys were working beyond anyone's most optimistic expectations, but the Japanese adapted because they had to. their snipers were dying at completely unsustainable rates. Japanese commanders recognized the threat and ordered their snipers to stop firing at single exposed targets, to only engage groups of Marines or targets that were clearly moving and talking to each other. To ignore static helmets and assume everything suspicious was a decoy. But that adaptation came with its own heavy cost because the snipers became significantly less effective at their primary mission. They passed up shots they would have taken before, shots that might have been real targets. And American Marines moved more freely across the battlefield because they could sense the snipers' hesitation and confusion. Some Japanese snipers simply couldn't resist when they saw what looked like an absolutely perfect target because training and instinct are hard to overcome in the moment. They fired anyway, and they died anyway. The most dramatic example of the decoy tactic's effectiveness happened on November 23rd, when a particularly deadly Japanese sniper position in the island's Central Command bunker had killed 11 Marines over the previous 4 days. This sniper was operating from inside a reinforced concrete structure with multiple firing ports, and American forces couldn't figure out which port he was using at any given moment. Every time they suppressed one port with concentrated fire, he'd calmly move to another port and keep shooting, killing Marines who thought they'd solved the problem. Staff Sergeant William Parker decided he was done playing games with this particular sniper. Parker commanded a 12-man squad from Ohio, and he'd lost 4 men to that bunker sniper over the last few days, and he was absolutely done being patient and cautious. Parker had his men construct 6 separate helmet decoys, and then he positioned his Marines at different locations all around the bunker in a rough semicircle. His plan was brilliantly simple: raise all 6 decoys simultaneously from different angles and directions, forcing the sniper to choose one target, and when he fired and revealed which port he was using, the other 5 positions would all see the muzzle flash from their different angles and triangulate his exact location. At precisely 10:15 hours, all 6 decoys went up at once like a coordinated dance, and the sniper made his choice and fired, hitting one of the decoys straight through the helmet. The muzzle flash came from the bunker's northwest firing port, and now everyone knew exactly where he was. Parker's entire squad immediately converged all their fire on that single port, pouring 30 rounds of rifle ammunition into that small opening. 2 sustained bar bursts that chewed up the concrete edges, and then one Marine threw a satchel charge straight through the opening like a perfect football pass. The satchel charge detonated inside the bunker with a muffled crump that shook the ground, and the sniper never fired another shot ever again. When Marines finally cleared that bunker later in the day, they found him dead from the satchel charge explosion, and his Arisaka rifle was still in position against the firing port, meaning he'd been aiming through it when the charge went off. Parker's 6 decoy tactic became standard operating procedure almost immediately, spreading through the division faster than official orders could possibly travel, and squads across the 2nd Marine Division started using multiple DKs to triangulate sniper positions with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese couldn't counter this new tactic no matter what they tried because they were trapped in an impossible situation. If they didn't shoot, Marines advanced freely and took objectives, but if they did shoot, they revealed their carefully prepared positions and died within minutes. By November 24th, American forces had eliminated an estimated 340 Japanese snipers on Tarawa using helmet decoys or clever variations of that basic technique. Most were killed because the decoys forced them to fire at false targets, waste their limited ammunition, and expose themselves to immediate counterfire from Marines who were actively hunting them. Marine casualties from sniper fire dropped to single digits per day, and the elaborate killing field the Japanese had spent months preparing became a graveyard for their own elite specialists. But here's the part of the story that bothers me most, and it should bother you too. Holland's contribution never received official recognition from the Marine Corps. No medal, no commendation, not even a mention in the after-action reports that were filed after Tarawa was secured. The Marine Corps officially credited the dramatic improvement in casualty rates to improved small unit tactics developed in the field. And the helmet decoy technique was bureaucratically attributed to field innovations that multiple units had developed independently, which wasn't remotely true. Holland's name appeared in his battalion's casualty logs as wounded on November 25th, when he'd taken shrapnel from a Japanese artillery shell, non-life-threatening wounds to his left leg and shoulder that got him evacuated to a hospital ship and then to Pearl Harbor for proper treatment. He never knew how many Marines survived because of his simple farm trick. Never knew that the helmet decoy technique spread far beyond Tarawa to other Pacific campaigns. Never knew that Marines at Saipan and Iwo Jima and Okinawa would use that same basic principle to counter Japanese snipers and save countless lives. The technique evolved and became more sophisticated as the war continued. By 1944, some Marine units were deploying incredibly realistic decoys. Full-size mannequins with detailed heads made from plaster or papier-mâché. Remote-controlled movement systems using wire and pulleys that could simulate realistic human motion. And one engineer battalion on Okinawa even created decoys that appeared to breathe using a hand-pumped bellows system that moved the chest up and down. But the fundamental principle remained exactly the same as what Holland had learned hunting crows on his father's wheat farm in Kansas. Make the enemy waste their ammunition shooting at nothing while you locate and eliminate them, simple as that. After the war finally ended in 1945, the Marine Corps conducted extensive studies analyzing sniper tactics throughout the entire Pacific theater, and they examined casualty data, interviewed thousands of veterans, and compiled after-action reports from every major campaign. Those studies conclusively confirmed what Holland had discovered through pure instinct and desperation in combat. Decoys were one of the absolute most effective counter-sniper techniques used in the Pacific theater, and units that employed decoys systematically had 67% fewer casualties from sniper fire compared to units that didn't use them, which is a staggering difference that translated directly to thousands of lives saved. The Marine Corps integrated decoy tactics into their official post-war training doctrine, and every infantry squad learned how to construct and deploy helmet decoys as part of their basic combat training, and the technique became standard operating procedure that was taught to every Marine for generations. But those studies and training manuals never mentioned Marcus Holland's name. Not once, and the official documentation credited the technique to generic field innovations developed during the Tarawa campaign without identifying any individual Marine as the originator who'd figured it out first. Holland returned to Kansas in 1946 after spending 22 months in the Pacific, fighting at Tarawa and Saipan and Tinian, and he was wounded twice in combat, receiving the Purple Heart both times for wounds received in action. But he received absolutely no other decorations or recognition. He went straight back to the wheat farm where he'd grown up, worked alongside his aging father like nothing had changed, married his high school sweetheart Dorothy in 1947, had 3 children over the next decade, and lived quietly without ever talking about what he'd done in the war. When people in Liberal asked about his service, which wasn't often because most veterans didn't like talking about it. He'd say he'd been an infantryman in the Pacific, fought the Japanese for a while, and that was all there was to tell. He never mentioned the helmet decoys, never talked about the snipers or about all the Marines who died before he figured out the farm trick that could have saved them. His own children didn't even know their father had saved lives until 1988, more than 40 years after the war ended, when a military historian researching Marine Corps counter-sniper tactics at Tarawa found obscure references to helmet decoys buried in battalion. Reports from November 1943. 1. Particular report mentioned Private First Class Marcus Holland by name as having demonstrated effective use of improvised target DKs to locate and eliminate enemy snipers, and that historian tracked Holland down through veteran registries and old military records. Holland was 67 years old by then, still working the same wheat farm, still shooting crows every harvest season using the same decoy methods he'd learned from his father decades before. The historian asked him about the decoys, and Holland confirmed the story but said it wasn't anything particularly special, just applied what his father had taught him about dealing with crows. Same principle worked fine on snipers who behaved exactly the same way. That historian did the mathematics based on casualty reduction rates before and after the helmet decoy technique was implemented, and he calculated that the technique probably saved between 120 and 180 American lives at Tarawa alone, just on that one small island. If you counted how the technique spread to other campaigns throughout the Pacific and how many Marines learned it and used it successfully, the total number could potentially be as high as 600 Marines who survived the war because of what Holland figured out. Holland said he'd never counted and never wanted to count. He just remembered the men in his squad who'd survived. Russo and Bennett and Carpenter and the others who tested those first crude decoys and lived through the hell of Tarawa to go home eventually. Staff Sergeant William Parker retired from the Marine Corps in 1965 after serving for more than 20 years, becoming a career NCO who served in Korea and spent years training new recruits at Parris Island. And in his retirement speech, Parker specifically mentioned Tarawa and the bunker sniper who'd killed 11 Marines before a farm kid from Kansas taught him to use 6 helmet decoys simultaneously to triangulate and eliminate that threat. Parker actually tracked Holland down in 1972, drove all the way to Kansas, knocked on Holland's farmhouse door, and introduced himself as the sergeant who'd used those 6 decoys to kill the bunker sniper back in 1943. Parker told Holland that he'd taught the helmet decoy technique to every single recruit he'd trained over 20 years at Parris Island, which meant thousands of Marines had learned it directly from him. And many of those Marines had used it successfully in combat situations and survived because they knew how to make snipers waste ammunition on false targets. Parker said Holland deserved the Navy Cross for that innovation, which is the second highest military decoration for valor. But Holland disagreed completely and said he'd just been trying to keep his squad alive. That any farm kid who'd spent time hunting crows would have probably done the exact same thing if they'd been in that situation. The helmet decoy technique remained in active use throughout the Vietnam War, where Marine Corps reconnaissance teams used sophisticated variations of it to locate Viet Cong snipers operating in dense jungle terrain where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The decoys continued evolving with available technology, and some units experimented with inflatable mannequins that looked realistic from a distance. while others developed thermal decoys that emitted heat signatures designed to fool enemy infrared optics that were becoming more common. By the 1980s, the physical decoy technique had largely become obsolete as modern warfare shifted dramatically to longer engagement ranges measured in thousands of yards. Thermal imaging systems that could see through darkness and vegetation, and precision-guided weapons that eliminated the need for patient stalking. Counter-sniper doctrine evolved to focus primarily on electronic detection systems and satellite surveillance rather than physical decoys. But the fundamental principle survived in training materials and was still taught as an example of battlefield innovation under extreme pressure. Every Marine infantry officer still learns about decoy tactics at the basic school in Quantico. And the helmet trick is specifically taught as a case study in how simple solutions immediately implemented can save lives when complex doctrines fail. The training materials still don't mention Marcus Holland by name. They still credit the technique to unnamed Marines at Tarawa who figured things out under fire. Holland died on June 12, 1994, at age 73 from complications related to diabetes that he'd managed for years. His funeral in Liberal, Kansas drew maybe 40 people total, just family and a few old friends and 3 veterans he'd served with who were still alive and healthy enough to travel. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in World War II. Noting he was a Marine Corps veteran who'd served in the Pacific Theater and received the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. But it didn't mention that he'd saved approximately 143 Marines with a helmet mounted on a stick. Didn't mention that he'd fundamentally changed counter-sniper doctrine for generations. Didn't mention that thousands of Marines learned his technique and some of them survived combat because of it. For a man Holland had never met attended that funeral, and they introduced themselves to Holland's family after the service ended and everyone was standing around uncertain what to say. They were all former Marines who'd served in different wars, Korea and Vietnam and even Desert Storm. And they'd all been trained in helmet decoy tactics at some point during their service. And they'd all survived combat situations because they knew how to make enemy snipers waste ammunition on false targets. They'd tracked Holland down through veteran networks after hearing his story, wanting his family to know what he'd actually done, wanting his children and grandchildren to understand that their father and grandfather had been more than just another infantryman who served his time and came home. Holland's children learned the full story that day standing in a Kansas cemetery, learned about the crows and the wheat farm and the desperate situation at Tarawa, learned about the simple trick that saved lives when nothing else worked. And they finally understood why their father spent every August shooting crows with such methodical precision. Today, Holland's story exists only in scattered fragments that you have to search for if you want to find them. Buried in battalion reports at the National Archives. Mentioned briefly in interview transcripts compiled by military historians. Referenced in a single paragraph in an academic study about counter-sniper tactics in the Pacific. The Marine Corps Museum at Quantico has a small display about Tarawa that shows a helmet mounted on a bayonet behind protective glass. And the placard says improvised decoy used by Marines to locate Japanese sniper positions. November 1943, but it doesn't mention Marcus Holland's name or explain that this simple device changed how America fought. If you dig through the archived training films from the 1950s that are slowly deteriorating in storage, you can find grainy footage of young Marines practicing decoy deployment techniques. And the narrator's voice explains the basic procedure in that formal military style they used back then. Mount a helmet on a stick or bayonet, raise it slowly above cover, watch carefully for muzzle flashes, engage the sniper with concentrated fire. The narrator doesn't explain where the technique originally came from. Doesn't mention that it violated every official military manual because it wasn't in any manual when it was first used. Doesn't mention that it started with a farm kid who'd learned to outwit crows and applied that same principle to trained enemy snipers. That's how real innovation actually happens in war. Not through doctrine committees sitting in safe offices or through expensive research programs that take years to produce results, but through individual Marines who see problems killing their friends and solve those problems using whatever knowledge they happen to have. Through people who ignore official manuals when those manuals are getting people killed. Who trust what worked on the family farm more than what's written in regulations that were created by people who'd never been shot at. Holland hunted crows for 40 more years after the war ended, never missing a harvest season, applying that same decoy principle every single August when the crows came to strip his wheat fields. His wheat yields averaged 93% over those decades. Consistently the best in his entire county, and he applied that same patient, methodical principle to Japanese snipers on a coral island 6,000 miles from home, and he didn't miss them either. His simple technique saved 143 American Marines, forced Japanese snipers to burn through their limited ammunition 3 times faster than normal, fundamentally changed how the United States Marine Corps approached counter-sniper operations for generations, and almost nobody remembers his name or knows what he did. But you know now, and that matters more than you might think because these stories deserve to be told and remembered. If this story moved you the way it genuinely moved us while researching it, do us one simple favor. Hit that like button right now. Because every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people who actually care about the forgotten heroes who saved lives without ever seeking recognition. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're rescuing these incredible stories from archives and obscurity every single week. And you're not just a passive viewer, you're actively part of keeping these memories alive for future generations. Tell us your location in the comments. Tell us if someone in your family served in any war. Just let us know you're here and that these stories matter to you. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering Marcus Holland.